The humiliation hung thick in the air, suffocating and bitter. "You are nothing here." "Nothing," Eric Simmons hissed, his voice low and dangerous, the words dripping with contempt. His pale blue eyes locked onto Clara Johnson with an icy, unshakable certainty, as if daring her to defy him. Clara kept her back straight, gripping the mop handle tightly, her knuckles whitening under the pressure. "Sir, the floors are clean," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I've mopped them over and over again." Without another word, Eric reached for the full cup of water on his desk. The movement was deliberate, slow, designed for effect. In one swift motion, he tipped it forward, and the water cascaded down onto her head, drenching her completely. The cold liquid soaked through her uniform, running in chilling rivulets down her face and into the collar of her shirt. It pooled at her feet, darkening the already spotless floor. A gasp escaped her lips at the sheer shock of it, but it wasn't the temperature that made her breath hitch. It was the sheer cruelty of the act, the calculated malice behind it. Eric Simmons wasn't just humiliating a cleaner, he was testing his power, his dominance. He leaned in, voice dangerously calm. "Now you have something real to clean up." The smirk tugging at his lips was filled with satisfaction. Clara inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay composed. Every fiber of her being wanted to stand up, rip off this disguise, and end his career right here and now. One word, one reveal, and Eric Simmons would be out on the street before the hour was up. But that wasn't the plan. Not yet. With slow, deliberate movements, she reached for her mop and began wiping up the water around her feet. Her soaked clothes clung to her skin, the chill biting deep, but she refused to give him the reaction he wanted. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Eric Simmons had just sealed his fate. He just didn't know it yet. Her sleek, straightened hair returned to its natural curls, now tucked under a simple headscarf. The perfectly manicured nails were trimmed short, her signature makeup wiped away. Contact lenses replaced her distinctive designer glasses, and the diamond studs she never removed were switched out for plain metal hoops. The transformation was complete. Clara Johnson no longer existed. In her place stood Janet, an unremarkable cleaning woman, destined to fade into the background of corporate life. Samuel Johnson ensured her placement through a third-party cleaning service, ProClean, shielding her identity from Johnson Technologies' Human Resources Department. The paperwork was handled with airtight discretion, crafting a foolproof cover story. As far as anyone in the company knew, Janet was just another new hire, assigned to the executive floor's night shift. The stakes were high. Clara had only 2 weeks to uncover the truth about the company she would soon lead. 2 weeks to determine if Johnson Technologies still reflected the values her father had instilled at its founding. What she didn't realize was that these 2 weeks would change everything, not just her understanding of the company, but of power, privilege, and leadership itself. That first night, Clara, now fully disguised, adjusted the stiff fabric of her ill-fitting uniform. The unfamiliar employee badge clipped to her chest felt foreign, a stark contrast to the executive ID that once granted her access to boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. Now she stood waiting, just another worker in the lowest rung of the corporate ladder. Her shift began at 10 p.m., long after the executives had left the building. Orientation was rushed and impersonal, a quick walkthrough of cleaning procedures, a stern warning about theft, and no introductions. The supervisor barely made eye contact as he tossed her a ring of keys and a checklist of duties. Throughout her life, Clara commanded attention. As a Harvard graduate, as an executive, as Samuel Johnson's daughter. People noticed when she entered a room. They acknowledged her. But as Janet the cleaner, she was invisible. Executives walked past her without a glance, stepping around her cleaning cart as if she weren't there. Some even bumped into her without an apology. Inside offices, employees discussed confidential business matters without lowering their voices, not seeing her as a person, but as part of the furniture. By the end of her first shift, Clara had already developed calluses on her once soft hands. The aches in her muscles were sharp, but even more painful was the realization that the company she thought she knew looked entirely different from the bottom up. She wasn't even Janet the cleaner. At that moment, she was nothing. At least, that's what Eric Simmons wanted her to believe. The water clung to her skin, ice cold, soaking through her uniform, dripping onto the floor she had just spent an hour perfecting. Every part of her body screamed for her to react, to wipe the smug grin off Eric's face, to stand tall and reveal who she really was. She had the power to destroy him, but not yet. The hall was empty, the only sound the slow drip, drip, drip of water pooling at her feet. Eric stood over her, his stance casual, his arms folded across his chest as if daring her to break character. "This is exactly why we should replace all of you with robots," he muttered. "At least they follow instructions the first time." Clara clenched her fists. The urge to retaliate burned inside her, but she forced herself to breathe, to think, to wait. Instead of responding, she bent down slowly, methodically, reaching for the mop. Eric snorted. "Good girl." Then, without another glance, he stepped right through the puddle he had just created, tracking muddy footprints down the corridor. Clara squeezed the mop handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. The humiliation stung worse than the cold, worse than the exhaustion that was already wearing on her after days of this treatment. But she wasn't breaking. Not tonight. The next few nights, Eric's cruelty escalated. He seemed to relish singling her out, pushing her further. A smudge on the window no one else could see. A speck of dust that didn't exist. A full trash can he forgot to empty himself, dumped onto the floor. And through it all, Clara endured. She cataloged every moment, not just in her mind, but in actual recordings. Her phone, discreetly hidden in her cleaning cart, captured his voice, his words, his humiliation tactics. Soon she wouldn't just clean up his messes, she would clean house. Eric Simmons just didn't know it yet. She was simply a human being treated as less than human by someone who knew there would be no consequences. Water dripped from Clara Johnson's soaked uniform, pooling around her feet, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She fought back the stinging in her eyes, refusing to let Eric Simmons see her break. Instead, she forced herself to kneel, her body trembling, not from the cold, but from the sheer humiliation. The mop dragged heavily against the puddle as she absorbed every second of this moment, engraving it into her memory. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every worker who had been humiliated and silenced, every janitor, server, and night shift employee who had ever been made to feel small, invisible. As she cleaned the mess Eric had created, a silent vow formed in her mind. He would face consequences. But he wasn't the only one. A new predator emerges. Marcus Reynolds, the marketing director, was another kind of tyrant. At 42, he had the look of a man who carefully constructed his own image. Designer glasses, artfully tousled hair, and bespoke suits that made him appear polished but not too corporate. Unlike Eric, who wielded power through brute humiliation, Marcus manipulated situations to exercise control. Clara's first real encounter with him came during her second week. She had been assigned his office as part of her rotation that night, a routine task that should have taken no more than 20 minutes. Instead, it stretched into a 3-hour ordeal that left her physically exhausted and dangerously behind schedule. It began simply enough. She entered his office at 10:05 p.m., clipboard in hand, noting that the space was relatively tidy. A few coffee cups on a table, stacks of papers arranged neatly. Hardly the disaster zone he later claimed. "Oh good, you're here," Marcus said without looking up from his glowing computer screen. "This place is a mess. We had a creative brainstorming session today, so it needs a deep clean." His tone was clipped, dismissive, as if she were a malfunctioning piece of equipment rather than a person. Clara nodded and got to work. She had learned not to argue. She emptied the trash, wiped the glass surfaces, and vacuumed the carpet. She was nearly finished when Marcus cleared his throat dramatically. "That's not how you clean glass," he muttered, rising from his desk. "You're leaving streaks everywhere. Circular motions, not straight lines." Clara froze for half a second, then forced herself to nod obediently. She grabbed the cloth and began again. Marcus didn't move away. He watched her, closely. As she worked, he pointed out imaginary smudges, forcing her to redo areas that were already spotless. His scrutiny became deliberate, invasive. When she finished, he performed a theatrical inspection, running his fingers along the desk, then holding them up to the light as if checking for dust. "This simply won't do," he sighed dramatically. "The windows are still streaked, the carpet has lint. And did you even dust the picture frames at all?" He wasn't satisfied until she cleaned the entire office 3 times. By the time she finally left, it was after 1 o'clock a.m. She was so far behind schedule that she had to skip her break just to finish her shift on time. As the days went on, she learned the truth. Marcus did this regularly. He would deliberately create messy situations, balancing coffee cups on the edge of trash cans so they would spill, scattering paper clips across vacuumed carpets, just so he could summon the cleaners back and reassert his dominance. Clara was now on his radar. After the water bottle incident with Eric, Clara decided to test the company's reporting structure. If Johnson Technologies truly stood for dignity and respect, then surely human resources would handle workplace abuse appropriately. That led her to Madeline Brooks, the HR director. At first glance, Madeline seemed like an ally, a woman in her mid-40s, with a warm smile and a casual business style that made her feel approachable. Her office walls were covered with motivational posters, including one that featured her own face, alongside the phrase, "Talk to me, your voice matters." Clara tested that promise. During her break the next day, she cautiously stepped into Madeline's office, where she was welcomed with a kind smile and a freshly brewed cup of coffee from the HR director's personal machine. "What can I do for you today?" Madeline asked, her tone pleasant. "I don't think we've met before. Are you new to the cleaning staff?" Clara took a slow breath before answering. "Yes, ma'am, I wanted to report an incident." She then carefully described what Eric had done, the public humiliation, the water bottle, the cruel laughter that followed. Madeline's smile remained, but something changed. Her head tilted slightly, her brows furrowed in what appeared to be genuine concern. But then, her expression smoothed over. She sighed, patted Clara's hand, and spoke in the measured, rehearsed tone of a corporate veteran trained to handle problems without actually solving them. "First, I want to thank you for bringing this to my attention," she began. Clara's stomach sank. That phrase, that polished, meaningless phrase. Madeline continued, "That said, I think there might be a misunderstanding about workplace relationships here. You have to remember that different roles come with different expectations. You're just a cleaner, sweetheart." Clara's pulse pounded in her ears. "Eric Simmons has high standards," Madeline went on, her tone still infuriatingly gentle. "He expects excellence, and sometimes that pressure can come off a little harsh. My advice? Just keep your head down and focus on meeting expectations. I promise it's nothing personal." Clara thanked her through gritted teeth, rose from her chair, and left that office with more clarity than ever. There would be no justice here, at least not the way they expected. What Madeline didn't know, what Eric and Marcus didn't know, was that Clara had just secretly recorded the entire conversation. And she wasn't done collecting evidence yet. Clara kept her account factual and emotionless, recounting Eric Simmons's actions, his public humiliation, the water bottle incident, and the culture of fear he had created. Across the desk, Madeline Brooks, the HR director, listened with a carefully controlled expression. She tilted her head slightly, her mouth tightening in what seemed like concern. But Clara had seen enough corporate maneuvering to recognize false empathy when she saw it. When she finished speaking, Madeline let out a deep sigh as if weighed down by the burden of handling yet another small problem. Then she reached across the desk, placing a hand over Clara's in a gesture that straddled the line between comforting and condescending. "First," Madeline began, her voice rehearsed, polished, and just sympathetic enough to sound sincere, "I want to thank you for bringing this to my attention." Clara's stomach tightened. That phrase, the corporate equivalent of a pat on the head, used to dismiss rather than address real concerns. Madeline continued, her voice still warm, but with an undeniable shift in tone, one that subtly dismissed the severity of Clara's complaint. "That said," she went on, "I think there may be some confusion about workplace relationships here. You're just a cleaner, and in a company like this, you can't compare yourself to other employees." The message was crystal clear beneath the corporate jargon. You don't really count. Your dignity is not our concern. Clara forced herself to stay silent, though anger burned in her chest. She had expected resistance, but hearing it so plainly was still infuriating. She stood, thanked Madeline through gritted teeth, and turned to leave. But just before she reached the door, Madeline spoke again, her voice lower as if sharing a secret. "Between us," she said lightly, "Eric can be demanding. He has high standards, and yes, sometimes his communication style is a bit direct. She smiled as if expecting Clara to find comfort in the absurdity of the understatement. Madeline leaned forward slightly, her eyes calculating. My suggestion? Don't take things personally. In corporate environments, thick skin is an asset. With that final, thinly disguised dismissal, Clara was shown the door. As she stepped into the hallway, the safe space sign on Madeline's door seemed to mock her. Its promise was nothing more than an empty slogan, one that apparently didn't apply to the people who cleaned the building after hours. But what Madeline didn't know, what Eric Simmons didn't know, what Marcus Reynolds didn't know, was that Clara had just recorded the entire conversation. Her phone, silently tucked into her cleaning cart, had captured every dismissive word, every corporate excuse, every failure of leadership. And she wasn't done gathering evidence yet. A shocking display of power. If Eric and Marcus had exposed the systematic nature of workplace abuse, Natalie Parker, Senior Vice President of Sales, would show Clara just how dangerous that power could be when left unchecked. Natalie was a legend at Johnson Technologies. Her sales team consistently outperformed expectations, and her high-stakes negotiations had secured multi-million-dollar contracts that cemented the company's market dominance. At 45, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her worth and the temperament of someone who had never been challenged. Clara's collision with her came on Friday evening of her third week undercover. She had been assigned to clean the main conference room on the 38th floor, a standard routine task. As she pushed her cleaning cart down the hall, Natalie's sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, where do you think you're going?" Clara paused, surprised by the directness of the address. She turned to face Natalie, whose icy stare was locked onto her. "I'm sorry for interrupting, ma'am," Clara said politely. "This room is scheduled for cleaning at 9 p.m. I'll come back later when your meeting is finished." In any normal workplace, that would have been the end of the interaction. But Natalie Parker did not operate under normal workplace conventions. "How dare you disrupt my meeting?" she snapped, stepping closer. "Do I have to waste my valuable time explaining basic professional courtesy to someone who scrubs toilets for a living?" The words cut through the room like a whip. Clara stiffened, but before she could react, she became aware of the eyes on her. Through the glass walls of the conference room, employees in nearby offices had begun to glance toward the confrontation. But just like in Eric's hallway, just like in Marcus's office, no one moved, no one spoke, no one intervened. They were witnesses to the abuse, and yet they did nothing. A familiar rage boiled in Clara's chest, but she forced herself to stay composed. "With all due respect," she said quietly but firmly, "I am following the established protocol for this building. If there's a conflict with the cleaning schedule, the proper procedure is to notify facility management. I am simply trying to do my job, just as you are doing yours." For one long, charged second, Natalie Parker froze. A cleaner had dared to push back. Around the room, junior employees sat motionless, their expressions locked in shock. For a moment, even Natalie herself seemed momentarily stunned that someone she had dismissed as a nobody had spoken with such confidence. The silence did not last. Natalie's face twisted in rage. Without warning, she swung her hand out in a sharp arc. Her palm connected with Clara's cheek, the crack echoing through the silent conference room. The force of the slap snapped Clara's head to the side, sending her stumbling backward against her cleaning cart. "Don't you ever talk back to me," Natalie hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "You are nothing here. Nothing." Clara's cheek burned, but it was nothing compared to the shock that rooted her to the spot. For all the cruelty she had endured at the hands of Eric Simmons and Marcus Reynolds, for all the humiliation, for all the silent abuses of power, this was different. She had just been physically assaulted in a corporate boardroom, and just like before, no one spoke, no one objected. But this time, Clara wasn't just collecting evidence. She was preparing for war. The urge to reveal herself, to transform from Janet the cleaner into Clara Johnson, executive vice president and heir to the company, was almost overwhelming. One sentence, just a few well-chosen words, could have ended Natalie Parker's career on the spot. The power to crush her arrogance, to strip away her false sense of superiority, was right there, waiting to be used. But Clara didn't use it. Some deeper instinct held her back. Instead, she forced herself to bow her head, murmured an apology she didn't mean, and returned to scrubbing the floors as if she truly were nothing more than a lowly janitor. Her cheek burned from the slap, but her mind had never been clearer. This was the breaking point, not because the physical pain was worse than what Eric Simmons had done, not because the humiliation was sharper than what Marcus Reynolds had inflicted, but because this moment represented something deeper, darker, more insidious. Johnson Technologies, the company her father had built on dignity and respect, had become a place where employees could be physically assaulted without consequence. As she mechanically wiped down the glass conference table, the oblivious sales team continued their work, ignoring her existence. This was no longer just about observing company culture. This was no longer about gathering impressions. This was about exposing the rot at its core. Clara was no longer a silent witness. She was an architect of reckoning, and when her 2 weeks undercover were complete, the reckoning would begin, collecting the final pieces of evidence. By the end of her second week, Clara had experienced enough abuse to justify ending the experiment and returning to her executive role. She had endured systematic mistreatment, both verbal and physical assault, in a toxic culture that festered beneath the company's polished reputation. Now it was time to turn the tables. Her first step was to secure a system for collecting evidence. The cleaning cart provided the perfect cover. No one paid attention to the supplies neatly arranged in its compartments. Inside a bottle labeled Industrial Surface Cleaner, Clara had concealed a small, high-resolution camera. Among the rags and disposable gloves, she had hidden a digital voice recorder, capturing conversations in meeting rooms, hallways, and executive offices. Her phone, always silenced in her pocket, allowed her to take still images when necessary, though she used it sparingly to avoid detection. Each night, she continued to perform her cleaning duties, all while strategically positioning herself to document evidence. She photographed confidential documents carelessly left on desks. She recorded off-the-cuff conversations where executives openly mocked lower-level employees. She captured the casual cruelty, the entitlement, the corrupt deals whispered after hours. Soon, Clara had enough damning evidence to tear down the company's entire leadership. Then she discovered something even bigger. The conspiracy unfolds. The three people who had made her life miserable, Eric Simmons, Marcus Reynolds, and Natalie Parker, weren't just bullies. They were thieves. Clara uncovered a hidden financial paper trail, buried in carelessly discarded printouts in email threads left open on unattended computers. They had been diverting company funds, money meant for lower-wage workers, meant for company benefits, meant for employee wellness programs, into their own pockets. Worse, they had been leaking company data to competitors, attempting to undermine Samuel Johnson's leadership before his planned succession announcement. They wanted Samuel out before Clara could take over, and now Clara had the proof, the final decision. As the end of her undercover period approached, Clara faced a critical choice. Simply presenting the evidence to her father would be enough to expose the conspiracy, but it wouldn't fix the deeper cultural issues. If she wasn't careful, this could turn into just another corporate scandal, with quick firings, a press release, and damage control. But Clara didn't want damage control. She wanted a complete transformation. This had to be public. It had to be undeniable. Revealing the truth, the final phase of Clara's mission required precision timing, strategic thinking, and the courage to confront the people who had humiliated her. On Friday evening, after finishing her shift, she changed out of her janitor's uniform in a public restroom several blocks away from Johnson Technologies headquarters. The transformation was stunning. She removed the headscarf, letting her natural curls fall freely. Her plain glasses were replaced with her signature designer frames. Her subtle makeup enhanced the features she had deliberately downplayed for weeks. For the first time in a month, she looked like herself again. She ordered a car to take her to her father's home in Maple Heights, a modernist mansion with glass walls overlooking the city skyline. From his office window, the Johnson Technologies Tower was visible, the same building where she had been scrubbing floors just hours earlier. The distance between these two worlds was only a few miles, but the psychological distance felt immeasurable. Her father was waiting for her in his office, his expression grave. "You look exhausted," he said simply, studying her face with paternal concern. "I am," Clara admitted, "but not just physically. I'm emotionally exhausted by what I've discovered. For the next 3 hours, she methodically presented her findings, displaying emails, financial records, performance reviews, and video evidence of abuse and corruption. She detailed the mistreatment of workers, the verbal and physical assaults, the financial crimes, and the conspiracy to force Samuel out before succession. Her father listened in complete silence. His expression darkened as the evidence mounted. When she showed him the video of Natalie Parker slapping Janet the cleaner, his fist clenched involuntarily. When she played the recording of Eric Simmons pouring water on her, his jaw tightened with barely controlled rage. "They've betrayed everything this company stands for," he said finally, his voice low, vibrating with intensity. "Everything I've built, everything I believed in." Clara nodded, knowing this wasn't just personal for her father, it was existential. This company wasn't just his legacy, it was his life's work. And now they had a choice: burn it all down or rebuild it from the ground up. The reckoning was coming, and this time Clara Johnson would be leading it. Clara Johnson had endured 2 weeks of humiliation as an undercover janitor, collecting evidence of corruption and abuse. Now, standing in the boardroom, it was time for the truth to come out. When Eric Simmons tried to dismiss her as just a cleaning lady, she stood tall, removed her headscarf and plain glasses, and revealed her true identity: the heir to Johnson Technologies. The room fell silent, stunned by the revelation. Then the evidence began. Clara played surveillance footage showing Eric pouring water over a janitor's head, exposing his cruelty. Next, she revealed emails and financial records, proving that Eric, Marcus Reynolds, and Natalie Parker had been stealing company funds and leaking confidential information. A recorded conversation captured Natalie's verbal abuse, while another exposed Marcus laughing about betraying the company. By the time Clara finished, the entire boardroom was in shock. Robert Johnson, her father and CEO, stood, his voice filled with controlled fury. He looked at the executives who had abused their power and betrayed the company's core values. "You have disgraced everything I built, everything I believed in." At that moment, security entered the boardroom. Eric tried to plead for mercy, claiming his 30 years at the company, but Robert's response was final. He had spent 30 years abusing his power, and now it was over. One by one, security escorted the corrupt executives out, their careers destroyed. Then Clara turned to the remaining leaders. "Now," she said, her voice firm, "let's talk about how we fix this company." Under Clara's leadership, Johnson Technologies changed. New worker protections were implemented. Executives were held accountable. The culture of fear and abuse was dismantled. One day, as Clara walked through the halls, she paused to thank a janitor. The woman blinked in surprise. "No one's ever said that before," she admitted. Clara smiled. "They will now," she promised, because this time change was here to stay. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Clara Johnson stood at the head of the table, no longer Janet the cleaner, but the rightful heir to Johnson Technologies. The weight of silence hung in the boardroom as recognition dawned on the stunned executives. Eric Simmons' sneer had disappeared. Marcus Reynolds sat frozen, his mind racing. Madeline Brooks gripped her pen, her usual confident posture now rigid with tension. They had all worked with Clara for years, attended meetings she led, discussed strategy with her. Yet none had recognized her in the weeks she had spent cleaning their floors. They had never truly seen the workers who kept the company running. Clara pulled a small remote from her pocket and clicked. The screen behind her flickered to life, revealing security footage. The first video showed Eric Simmons dumping a cup of water on a janitor's head, her head. The timestamp and location were clear, and Eric's smug expression as he humiliated her was undeniable. Eric paled. His voice broke as he scrambled for a defense. "That's taken out of context." "There is no context," Clara said sharply. The next slide played, Derek Phillips demanding multiple cleanings of an already spotless office, berating staff for made-up mistakes. His condescending smirk was on full display. More footage followed. Recordings of Marcus Reynolds discussing how he leaked company secrets. Emails proving Natalie Parker had diverted worker benefits into her own offshore accounts. Then came the moment of no return, a different camera angle of Veronica Wells. The entire room watched in stunned horror as she slapped the janitor across the face, hissing, "You are nothing here. Nothing." Veronica's breath hitched. Would you like me to play the audio as well, Ms. Wells? Clara's voice was icy. The room was suffocating with tension. Robert Johnson rose from his seat, his fury controlled but unmistakable. You have betrayed everything this company was built on, he said, his gaze locked on Eric, Marcus, Natalie, and Veronica. Everything I worked for. The doors opened. 2 security officers stepped inside. Mr. Simmons, Mr. Reynolds, Ms. Parker, and Ms. Wells, one of them said, firm but professional. You'll need to come with us. Eric stood abruptly, his face flushed with desperation. You can't do this. I gave this company 30 years. Robert's voice was measured, but unyielding. You had 30 years to do the right thing. Instead, you chose abuse, corruption, and greed. As security escorted them out, Clara turned to the remaining board members and executives. Now, she said, her voice steady, let's talk about how we fix this company. Change didn't happen overnight, but change did come. Under Clara's leadership, Johnson Technologies transformed. A whistleblower system was introduced. Executives were held accountable. The culture of fear was dismantled. One day as Clara walked through the halls, she stopped to thank a janitor, an older woman who had worked there since her father first started the company. The woman looked surprised. No one's ever said that before, she admitted. Clara smiled. They will now, she promised, because this time change was here to stay. The story of Clara Johnson's undercover journey at Johnson Technologies is a powerful lesson in leadership, integrity, and justice. It reveals the hidden power dynamics within corporations and the critical need for accountability at all levels. Through her experience as a janitor, Clara witnessed firsthand how employees without status or influence were treated with disrespect and cruelty. This underscores a universal truth. The way an organization treats its lowest-ranked workers is the true measure of its culture. One of the strongest lessons from this story is that real leadership requires understanding. Clara, despite her education and executive experience, realized that no boardroom strategy could replace first-hand knowledge. True leaders do not lead from a distance. They engage, listen, and experience the struggles of their workforce. By immersing herself in the company's most overlooked roles, Clara developed a newfound empathy that shaped her into a better, more effective CEO. Additionally, the story teaches us the importance of courage and persistence. Clara endured humiliation, abuse, and injustice, yet she remained calm and strategic, using her position to bring real change rather than simply seeking revenge. Her story is a reminder that power can be misused, but it can also be reclaimed and redirected for good. Lastly, this story highlights the need for ethical leadership. Without accountability, corruption thrives. But when one person dares to stand up and expose the truth, transformation is possible. Clara's actions didn't just remove toxic executives, they created lasting change, ensuring that every employee, no matter their title, was treated with respect and dignity. This is the kind of leadership the world needs, one that values justice, integrity, and the power of standing up for what is right. If you believe everyone deserves respect, no matter their job or status, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Tell us in the comments, have you ever witnessed or experienced workplace injustice? How would you handle a situation like Clara's? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an inspiring story of justice, leadership, and standing up for what's right.